Now, each state has their own Freedom of Information law, including New York, who has two. There's one law in New York City and another for the rest of the state, each county and the rest of the state. One expert on FOIA law told me today if those tapes were in New York, they most likely would not be released because of a precedent that was set in 2001 after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Surprise you at all that it went to a court in Connecticut over this matter?
Not at all. Not at all.
Bob Freeman works for the Department of State's Committee on Open Government. He says in New York there are two laws that deal with a public's request for 911 tapes. Everywhere but New York City, 911 calls cannot be foiled. In the Big Apple, he says it's a matter of discretion whether or not the tapes are released.
And FOIL, when it applies, offers that kind of flexibility.
Freeman says that was made evident in 2001 when the New York Times went to a court seeking the 911 tapes from the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. The paper lost in court after a judge reviewed the content of the tapes.
In the case of the Twin Towers, the Court of Appeals considered the sensitive nature of the calls in relation to those surviving family members. They were intimate. People knew that they were going to die. And that is different from, let's call it, the more typical 911 recording.
Freeman says, content-wise, it would be fair to compare the 911 tapes from the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the Newtown shooting. However, he says since each state has its own law, it's not fair to compare the decisions made by the respective courts. Are you surprised that it's being released?
In consideration of the distinctions among laws from one state to the next, not necessarily. Not necessarily. You know, we look at other states and the experience relative to exactly the same kinds of records is completely different from one jurisdiction to the next.
Now, according to the Associated Press, who again led the fight for these tapes, a Connecticut law was passed earlier this year that creates exemptions to the Freedom of Information law for the release of photographs, film, video, and other images depicting a homicide victim if the records constitute a, quote, unwarranted invasion on the privacy of the surviving family members. And again, despite that new law, obviously today, a few hours ago, those tapes were released. Liz?
And I'm assuming that family members of those who did lose their lives probably want nothing to do with these tapes. At least that's my assumption. But how about just in general, Pat, about the psychological impact of these?
Well, in fact, I just talked to a local expert about that just a short time ago, and they told me that there's actually a gray area there here. Obviously, there's no cut and dry answer. They told me that it all depends on what people are wanting to hear and see, what they're looking for on the tape. They said, as you mentioned, obviously family members probably not going to want to hear, especially if some media outlets release some more gruesome recordings of those 911 tapes. But she also said that there might be some family members of survivors of there, people who are not affected or hurt in the shooting, who said that they want to be reassured. Hearing these tapes, it would reassure them that their family members are okay and that they, in fact, may take a listen to these tapes. And we'll have much more on that aspect of this story coming up tonight at 6 o'clock.
All right. Thank you very much, Pat Bailey.
A new CNN poll released this afternoon shows support for gun control has dropped in the year after the Newtown shootings. But you'll remember, after the massacre, calls for stricter gun laws dominated the discussions. Our fact finders did a little digging. New York led that charge, passing one of the toughest gun laws in the nation. Other states, including California, Connecticut, Colorado, and Maryland, also tightened gun regulations. Nationally, efforts failed. President Obama said at the time he wanted to take meaningful action to prevent more tragedies, but those proposals fell short in Congress. Sandy Hook also sparked a mental health push, with at least 37 states increasing spending on mental health in the year since Adam Lanza's shooting rampage. A report released on the shooting says Lanza had a preoccupation with mass shootings, particularly the Columbine shooting, and that doctors described him as having significant social impairments and extreme anxiety.